Well, South Africa has over a decade now faced intermittent power cuts. The Constitution of South Africa states that access to electricity is a statutory obligation of South Africa's power utility Eskom. Recently, however, the embattled power utility announced that load shedding stage 3 would be implemented indefinitely, which means citizens could face at least one power cut or more a day. Now, speaking during yesterday's ANC Letsema campaign, President Cyril Ramaphosa apologized to the country for the rolling outages, saying that it's the biggest threat to the country's economy. Let's take a listen.
Eskom has been one of the biggest threats to our economy, but also a big problem to our people as a whole. And we admit that. And we know that our people are really suffering from the load shedding. And maybe for the umpteenth time, I will be able to say I am sorry that the country, you as a people, have been subjected to the load shedding that we are going through. And the problems of Eskom emanate from the past.
Well, can load shedding be considered a violation of basic human rights? Postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Public, Constitutional and International Law at the University of South Africa, Dr. Felix Dube, joins us now to give us some perspective. Dr. Dube, thank you so much for your time. As you would have heard in that audio clip, the President apologizing once again for load shedding and alerting us to how much of a threat it is to our economy. But what do the country's laws actually say about access to electricity?
Good morning, Dagozo and the viewers. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this program. I'm sure by right now we'll all agree that load shedding is not just an inconvenience. It threatens our livelihoods in so many ways. But as you have asked, do we have a right to electricity? And can we say that load shedding is a violation of that right? Let me start from the beginning and highlight that the Constitution of South Africa does not provide a direct right to electricity. Instead, this right to electricity is inferred by the courts from a cluster of rights in the Bill of Rights, the rights of which cannot be exercised without access to an uninterrupted and adequate supply of electricity. It is now accepted that electricity is indispensable in the modern era. You cannot have clean energy for cooking, for heating, powering industries, computers, cell phones, learning, and medical equipment if you do not have electricity. Therefore, the exercise of these other constitutional rights directly depends on the availability of electricity, particularly now in the modern era. Let me give you an example. Recently, I watched the Minister of Health saying that when there is load shedding, there is great risk to human life in hospitals because ventilators don't work. People who cannot breathe because they are on ventilators are at the risk of dying. So we now see that electricity is actually not only about providing health care, but it is also about our very existence, this right to life.
Well, Dr. Dube, let me just come in there because I think in essence, what you're saying is that, in terms of, any sort of legal framework, there really isn't one existing outside of Eskom's statutory obligations, but that because of our right to dignity and the right to a good quality of life, the courts have inferred this right to electricity. But we know that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. We have these fantastic laws that exist, but oftentimes in implementing them, in upholding them, we struggle because of the lack of resources that we have. How much of that compounds the issue of load shedding and access to electricity today?
Yes, I agree with you. There are a number of considerations that we should look at when we determine whether there is a right to electricity and whether this load shedding is actually interfering with that right. There is a concept in our law that talks about progressive realization of rights. Many people do not have electricity, and I think great strides have been made in the past decades or so to provide more people with access to electricity. But the law says that once you have given me access to a right, you cannot then come and take it away and say, well, you do not have the resources to provide for that right. And when you look at the situation with the load shedding, I don't think we really have to go into the issue of resources first. We have to ask ourselves, there has been many years that there has been no interrupted supply of electricity. What was happening during those years and what has changed? We have to be honest about the issues that are causing this load shedding. But not only that, we also have to ask ourselves what needs to be done, and what needs to be done then has to be done. In my view, the issue is actually more than the issue of resources. There is more that is at play, and we have to be honest as a nation about those issues and address them.
Talking about the more that is at play, one of those factors, Dr. Dube, is Eskom's liquidity crisis, right? Those challenges are no secret to South Africans. The utility presently simply can't afford to run its operations. Wouldn't enforcing a right to electricity further cripple Eskom?
I think there are different considerations on this. The first thing that we have to understand is that Eskom is an organ of state. It exercises power, public power, and it has a monopoly on the supply of electricity. And then some people tell that, of course, Eskom doesn't have the money. It has got liquidity problems. Municipalities are owing it a lot of money, like the money runs into millions and billions. Yes, that is true. But then we have to ask ourselves as a nation, what is the statutory obligation of Eskom? It is to provide an uninterrupted supply of electricity. It has to be reliable. Without electricity, nothing runs. So I think we have to go back to the drawing board again and say, which resources do we allocate where? And how best can we ensure that everyone has access to electricity? But maybe let me just quickly highlight something. So, of course, some people tell you that Eskom does not owe us a public duty to provide us with electricity. But we know that electricity is important for economic development. It is important for protecting the social well-being of electricity, of the nation. So we cannot really say that because, well, there is limited resources and then we cannot have electricity. Eskom is the biggest company probably in the country. It has got the biggest client base. Where is the money going?
Soweto residents, Dr. Dube, have been very vocal about the power crisis that they're experiencing a very unique situation as well, but they've been very vocal about the electricity crisis there, specifically around the issue of affordability. I'm curious about what happens to a right to electricity in an environment where the power utility that is tasked with supplying the electricity is struggling to do so. And this is also affected by the fact that the recipients, the consumers at the end of the supply chain can't afford to pay. How does that factor into the overall question that we're asking here of whether or not load shedding is a violation of a human right?
Oh, yes. On that aspect, I've actually did a bit of some research, and I found that last year, Eskom was actually informing consumers that those households that cannot afford electricity can actually go to their municipalities and register there as qualifying households, which are indigent households. And then the municipalities will forward that list to Eskom, and then Eskom is going to provide monthly vouchers to these households. So we see that Eskom is able to provide electricity for free to certain households. It is able to do that because it recognizes that it has got a duty to provide electricity.
All right, so we have the fact that the courts are inferring this right and not necessarily having any existing laws to hold Eskom to account on the issue of this potentially being a human rights violation. What sort of legal remedies can and should we in fact explore in addressing this particular issue?
So I did a bit of some research, and I found that previously the courts have said that they cannot interdict things like issues like load shedding. There is no legal framework for a court to say stop load shedding, because if a court says stop load shedding, it doesn't remove the fact that there is no energy. Right? It doesn't remove that aspect. But what we know is that Eskom owes us a public law duty to provide us with electricity through municipalities. It has to do that. So what it has to do, it has to look at its supply chain problems, it has to look at its management problems, and if it cannot resolve those issues, it should submit those issues to the government, which is the major shareholder. Then something has to be done. We need to be able to allocate resources towards this. And I think actually the problem is that perhaps we are acting reactively instead of proactively. We have to think ahead, many years, many decades ahead, as to how much power are we going to need, and then start preparing. I think that is going to solve our problem. Instead of saying, oh, okay, now we can no longer provide, so, well, let's start, let's see if we can load shed people. I think we need to think ahead. You remember that load shedding started long back, is it 2007 or so, and then it came back again 5 years or so ago, and it is still with us today. In my view, there is so much that could have been done between 2007 and today so that we never, as a nation, have to face load shedding. What has not been done, and why hasn't it been done, and what can be done to remedy that situation? I don't think it is impossible to address the situation.
Talking about looking ahead, Dr. Dube, is it possible for us to look into, the promulgation of legislation that would in future have better controls around a situation like the power crisis we find ourselves in today? A legislative framework that would hold the power utility to a much greater standard of delivery. And address this issue of progressive realization, because while government can say that they can, supply electricity progressively, there has to be reasonable time frames as well.
Yes, I do agree. Maybe I should first start highlighting on the issue of legislation. The issue that we have in South Africa is that we have many laws, and very good laws. The only issue is that the implementation part of it is a bit lagging, if not more lagging. So we have a problem with implementation. Even if we're going to have more laws, we'll still have the problem of them having been implemented. But remember, it is the obligation of the government through the state to provide for electricity. So us as a nation, we then have to hold the government accountable for the fulfillment of that obligation. And there are several ways of doing that. But also let me proceed to what you have asked about the issue of progressive realization.